The group focused its attention on her instead, though eyes continued to dart back and forth regularly to Harry. Well, well, you know why we're here. Harry here had an idea. Harry thrown her a sharp look. I had an idea that it might be good if people who wanted to study defense against the dark arts, and I mean really study it, not this rubbish that Umbridge is doing with us. Hermione's voice became suddenly much stronger and more confident, because nobody could call that defense against the dark arts. Hear, hear, said Anthony Goldstein, and Hermione looked heartened. Well, I thought it'd be good if we, took matters into our own hands. She paused, looked sideways at Harry, and went on. And by that, I mean learning how to defend ourselves properly, not just in theory, but doing the actual spells. You want to pass your defense against the dark OWL too, though, I bet, said Michael Corner. Of course I do, said Hermione at once. But, more than that, I want to be properly trained in defense because she took a great breath and finished. Because Lord Voldemort is back. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Cho's friend shrieked and slopped Butterbeer down herself. Terry Boot gave a kind of involuntary twitch. Padma Patil shuddered, and Neville gave an odd yelp, and that managed to turn into a cough. All of them, however, looked fixedly, even eagerly, at Harry. Well, that's the plan anyway, said Hermione. If you want to join us, we need to decide how we're going to. Where's the proof? You know who's back, said a blonde Hufflepuff player in a rather aggressive voice. Well, Dumbledore believes it, Hermione began. You mean Dumbledore believes him, said the blonde boy, nodding to Harry. Who are you? Said Ron rather rudely. Zacharias Smith, said the boy, and I think we've got the right to know exactly what makes him say you know who is back. Look, said Hermione, intervening swiftly. That's not really what this meeting's supposed to be about. It's okay, Hermione, said Harry. It had just dawned on him why there were so many people here. He thought Hermione should have seen this coming. Some of these people, may even most of them, had turned up in hopes of hearing Harry's story firsthand. What makes me say you know who's back? He asked, looking at Zacharias straight in the face. I saw him. But Dumbledore told the whole school what happened last year, and if you didn't believe him, you won't believe me. And I'm not wasting an afternoon trying to convince you. The whole group seemed to have held its breath while Harry spoke. Harry had not had the impression that even the barman was listening. He was wiping the same glass with that filthy rag, making it steadily dirtier. Zacharias said dismissively, all Dumbledore told us last year was Cedric Diggory got killed by you know who, and that you brought Diggory's body back to Hogwarts. He didn't give us details. He didn't tell us exactly how Diggory got murdered. I think we'd all like to know. If you come here to hear exactly what it looks like when Voldemort murders someone, I can't help you, said Harry. His temper, always so close to the surface these days, was rising again. He did not take his eyes off of Zacharias Smith's aggressive face and was determined not to look at Cho. I don't want to talk about Cedric Diggory right now, so if that's what you're here for, you might as well clear out. He cast an angry look at Hermione's direction. This was, he felt, all her fault. She had decided to display him like some sort of freak. Of course, they had come to turn up just to see how wild his story was, but none of them left their seats, not even Zacharias Smith, though he continued to gaze intently at Harry. So, said Hermione, her voice very high pitched again. So, like I was saying, if you want to learn some defense, then we need to work out how we're going to do it. How often we're going to meet, and where we're going to. Is it true, interrupted a girl with long plait down her back, looking at Harry, that you can produce a Patronus? There was a murmur of interest around the group at this. Yeah, said Harry slightly defensively. A corporeal Patronus? This phrase stirred something in Harry's memory. Uh, you don't know Madame Bones, do you? He asked. The girl smiled. She's my auntie, she said. I'm Susan Bones. She told me about your hearing So is it really true you make a stag a Patronus? Yes. Blimey, Harry, said Lee, looking deeply impressed. I never knew that. Mum told Ron not to spread it around, said Fred, grinning at Harry. She said he got enough attention as it was. She's not wrong, mumbled Harry, and a couple of people laughed. The veiled witch, sitting alone, shifted very slightly in her seat. And did you kill a basilisk with that sword in Dumbledore's office? Demanded Terry Boot. The one, the port, that's what one of the portraits on the wall told me when I was there last year. Ah. Yeah, I did. Yeah, said Harry. Finch Fletchley whistled, and Creevy Brothers exchanged awestruck looks, and Lavender Brown said, Wow, softly. Harry's now feeling slightly hot around the collar now. He was determinedly looking anywhere but at Cho. All in our first year, and in our first year, Neville said to the group, he saved the sorcerer's stone. Sorcerers, hissed Hermione. Yes, that. You know who? From you know who, finished Neville. Hannah Abbott's eyes were as round as galleons. And that's not to mention, said Cho. Harry's eyes snapped across to her. She was looking at him, smiling. His stomach did a somersault. All the tasks he had to get through in the Triwizard last year, getting past the dragons and merpeople and acromentulas and things. There was a murmur of impressed agreement around the table. Harry's insides were squirming. He was still trying to arrange his face so that he did not look too pleased with himself. The fact that Cho had praised him made it much, much harder for him to say the thing he had sworn to himself he would tell them. Look, he said, till everyone fell silent at once. I don't want to sound like I'm trying to be modest or anything, but I had a lot of help with that stuff. Not with the dragons, you didn't, said Michael Corner at once. That was some seriously cool bit of flying. Yeah, well, Harry said, feeling it would be churlish to disagree. And no one helped you get rid of the Dementors last summer. This summer, said Susan Bones. No, said Harry. No, okay, I did bits of it without help. But the point I'm trying to make is, are you trying to weasel out of showing us any of this stuff, said Zachariah Smith. Here's an idea, said Ron loudly before Harry could speak. Why don't you shut your mouth? Perhaps the word weasel had an effect on Ron particularly strongly. In any case, he was now looking at Zacharias as though he would like nothing better than to thump him. Zacharias flushed. Well, we've all turned up to learn from him, and now he's telling us he can't really do any of it, he said. That's not what he said, snarled Fred. Would you like to clean out your ears for you? Inquired George, pulling out a long, lethal-looking metal instrument from inside one of Zonko's bags. Or any part of your body, really. We're not fussy about where we stick this, said Fred. Yes, well, said Hermione hastily. Moving on, the point is, are we agreed we want to take lessons from Harry? There was a murmur of general agreement. Zacharias folded his arms and said nothing, though perhaps this was because he was too busy keeping an eye on the instrument in Fred's hand. Right, said Hermione, looking relieved that at least something had been settled. Well then, the next question is how often we do it. I really don't think there's any point in meeting less than once a week. Hang on, said Angelina. We need to make sure it doesn't clash with our Quidditch practice. No, said Cho, nor with ours. Nor ours, said Zacharias Smith. I'm sure we can find a night that suits everyone, said Hermione, slightly impatiently. But you know, this is rather important. We're talking about learning to defend ourselves against Voldemort's Death Eaters. Well said, barked Ernie Macmillan, who Harry had been expecting to speak long before this. Personally, I think this is really important. Possibly the most important thing anything else we do this year, even with our OWLs coming up. He looked around impressively, as though waiting for people to cry, surely not. Then nobody spoke. He went on. I personally am at a loss to see why the ministry has foisted such a useless teacher on us at such a critical period. Obviously, They're in denial about the return of you know who. But to give us a teacher who is trying to actively prevent us from defensive spells, we think the reason Umbridge doesn't want to us trained in defense against the dark arts, said Hermione, is that she's got some mad idea that Dumbledore could use the students in the school as kind of a private army. She thinks We think the reason Umbridge doesn't want us trained in defense against the dark arts, said Hermione, is that she's got some mad idea that Dumbledore could use the students in the school as kind of a private army. She thinks he'd mobilize us against the ministry. Nearly everyone looked stunned at this news, everyone except Luna Lovegood, who piped up, well, that makes sense. After all, Cornelius Fudge has got his own private army. What? Said Harry, completely thrown by this unexpected piece of information. Yes, he's got this army of heliopaths. Heliopaths, said Luna solemnly. No, he hasn't, snapped Hermione. Yes, he has, said Luna. What are heliopaths? Asked Neville, looking blank. They're spirits of fire, said Luna, her protruding eyes widening so that she looked madder than ever. Great tall flaming creatures that gallop across the ground, burning everything in front of. They do not exist, Neville, said Hermione tartly. Oh, yes, they do, said Luna angrily. I'm sorry, but there's no proof of that, snapped Hermione. There are plenty of eyewitness accounts. Just because you're so narrow minded, you need to have everything shoved under your nose before you. Ahem, said Ginny, in such a good imitation of Professor Umbridge that several people looked around in alarm and laughed. Weren't we trying to decide how often we were going to meet and have defensive lessons? Yes, said Hermione at once. Yes, we were. You're right, Ginny. Well, once a week sounds cool, said Lee. As long as, said Angelina. Yes, yes, we know about the Quidditch, said Hermione in a tense voice. Well, the other thing to decide is where we're going to meet. This was rather more difficult. The whole group fell silent. Library? Suggested Katie Bell after a few moments. I can't see Madam Pince being too chuffed with us being doing jinxes in the library, said Harry. Maybe an unused classroom, said Dean. Yeah, said Ron. McGonagall might let us have hers. She did when Harry was practicing for the Triwizard. But Harry was pretty certain that McGonagall would not be so accommodating this time, for all that Hermione had said about the study and homework groups being allowed. He had a distinct feeling that this one might be considered a little bit more rebellious. Right, well, we'll try and find somewhere else, said Hermione. We'll send a message around to everybody when we've got a time and a place for our first meeting. She rummaged in her bag and produced a parchment and a quill, then hesitated, rather as though she was steeling herself to say something. I I think everybody should write their name down just so we know who's here. But I also think, she took a deep breath, that we all ought to agree not to shout about what we're doing. So if you sign, you're agreeing not to tell Umbridge or anybody else what we're up to. Fred reached out for the parchment and cheerfully wrote his signature. But Harry noticed at once that several people looked less happy at the prospect of putting their names on this list. Said Zacharias slowly, not taking the parchment that George was trying to pass to him. Well, I'm sure Ernie will tell me when the meeting is. But Ernie was looking rather hesitant about assigning too. Hermione raised her eyebrows at him. Well, we're prefects, Ernie burst out. And if the list was found, well, I mean to say, you said yourself, if Umbridge finds out, you just said this group was most important thing you do this year. Harry rounded on him. Yes, said Ernie. Yes, I do believe that. It's just, Ernie, do you really think I'd leave this list lying around? Said Hermione testily. No, of course not, said Ernie, looking less anxious. Yes, of course I'll sign it. Nobody raised objections after Ernie. though Harry saw Cho's friend give her a rather reproachful look before adding her name. When the last person, Zacharias, had signed, Hermione took the parchment back and slipped it carefully into her bag. There was an odd feeling in the group now. It was as though they had just signed some kind of contract. Hmm. Well, time's ticking on, said Fred briskly, getting to his feet. George Lee and I have some items of sensitive nature to purchase. We'll be seeing you all later. In twos and threes, the rest of the group took their leave too. Cho made rather a business of fastening the catch on her bag before leaving, her long dark curtain of hair swaying forwards to hide her face. But her friend stood beside her, arms folded, clicking her tongue, so that Cho had little choice but to leave with her. As her friend ushered her out the door, Cho looked back and waved at Harry. Well, I think that went quite well, Hermione said happily, as she, Hermione, and Ron walked out of Hog's Head into the bright sunlight, and a few moments later, Harry and Ron were clutching their bottles of butterbeer. That Zacharias bloke's a wart, said Ron, who was glowering after the figure of Smith just discernible in the distance. I don't like him much either, admitted Hermione, but he overheard me talking to Ernie and Hannah at the Hufflepuff table, and he seemed to really be interested in coming, so what could I say? But the more people, the better, really. I mean, Michael Corner and his friends wouldn't have come if he hadn't been going out with Ginny. Ron, who had been draining the last few drops of his butterbeer, gagged, sprayed butterbeer down his front. He, what? Sputtered Ron, outraged, his ears now resembling the curls of raw beef. She's going out with my sister's going? What do you mean, Michael Corner? Well, that's why he and his friends came, I think. Well, they're obviously interested in learning defense, but Ginny hadn't told Michael what was going on. But if Ginny hadn't told Michael what was going on, when did she they met at the U Ball and got together at the end of last year, said Hermione composedly. They had turned into the high street, and then paused outside of Shriven Shaft's quill shop. There was a handsome display of feather quills in the window. I could do with a new quill. She turned into the shop. Harry and Ron followed her. Which one is Michael Corner? Said Ron, demanding furiously. The dark one, said Hermione. I don't like him, said Ron at once. Big surprise, said Hermione under her breath. But, said Ron, following Hermione along the row of quills and copper pots, I thought Ginny fancied Harry. Hermione looked at him rather pityingly and shook her head. Ginny used to fancy Harry, but she gave up on him months ago. Not that she doesn't like you, of course, she said kindly to Harry, while she examined the long black and gold quill. Harry, whose head was still full of Cho's parting wave, did not find the subject quite as interesting as Ron, who was positively quivering with indignation. But it did bring something home to him until now he had not really registered. So that's why she talks to me now? He asked Hermione. She never used to talk in front of me. Exactly, said Hermione. Yes, I think I'll have this one. She went up to the counter and handed over 15 sickles and 2 knuts, with Ron still breathing down her neck. Ron, she said severely as she turned and trod onto his feet, this is exactly why Ginny hadn't told you This is why Ginny hasn't told you she's seeing Michael. She knew you'd take it badly, so don't harp on about it, for heaven's sake. What do you mean? Who's taking anything badly? I'm not going to harp on about anything, said Ron, continuing to chutter about his breath all the way down the street. Hermione rolled her eyes at him, then said in an undertone, while Ron was still muttering imprecations about Michael Corner, talking about Michael and Jenny, what about Cho and you? What do you mean? Said Harry quickly. It was as though boiling water was rising rapidly inside him, and burning sensation that was causing his face to smart in the cold. He had been that obvious? Well, said Hermione, smiling slightly, she just couldn't keep her eyes off you, could she? Harry had never before appreciated just how beautiful the village of Hogsmeade was.